At 2 o'clock in the morning, in a dark parking lot somewhere in California, a young man sat alone inside his car, surrounded by boxes of running shoes. The windows were slightly fogged. His back hurt. His clothes smelled like gasoline, coffee, and long highway drives. A few hours later, he would wake up, drive to another track meet, open the trunk, and spend the entire day trying to convince strangers to buy shoes almost nobody in America had ever heard of. He wasn't famous. He wasn't rich. And honestly, there were moments when the whole thing looked close to failure. Years later, that same man would build one of the most recognizable companies on Earth. A company whose logo would appear in Olympic stadiums, rap videos, World Cup finals, basketball courts, and billions of social media photos. A company that would change not only sports, but culture itself. Nike. But the strange part is this. Back then, sitting alone in that car, Phil Knight didn't look like someone building an empire. He looked like someone trying to survive one more month. And maybe that's what makes this story feel so human. Because when people look at giant companies today, they imagine inevitability. They imagine confidence, vision, a perfect master plan. But most of the time, the beginning feels nothing like that. Most beginnings feel fragile, quiet, uncertain. Which raises a fascinating question. How does someone go from sleeping in a car with unpaid bills and boxes of shoes to creating one of the most powerful brands in modern history? To understand that story, you have to go back to a completely different America. An America before smartphones, before influencers, before startup culture turned founders into celebrities. Back then, life looked more stable, more predictable. People followed traditional paths. You found a respectable job, stayed there for years, built a safe future, and tried not to take unnecessary risks. And Phil Knight, at first glance, didn't look very different from millions of other young Americans growing up in the 1950s. He was born in Portland, Oregon, into a disciplined, middle-class family. His father worked in newspaper publishing and believed strongly in hard work. Very strongly. Phil later described him as demanding, emotionally distant at times, and skeptical of easy success. Nothing was simply handed to you. If you wanted something, you earned it. Maybe that pressure shaped Phil more deeply than he realized back then. As a teenager, he became interested in running. Not because he was a superstar athlete. He wasn't. He wasn't the fastest runner in America. He wasn't breaking world records. But he loved the psychological side of running. The strange battle that happens inside your own head during long distances. Running is a lonely sport. There are moments when your body hurts, your breathing becomes heavy, and your mind quietly starts asking a dangerous question. Why are you still doing this? Most people eventually stop. Some keep going. And maybe that mindset stayed with Phil long after college ended. At the University of Oregon, he ran track under coach Bill Bowerman, a man who would later become one of the most important figures in Nike's history. Bowerman was obsessed with improvement. Completely obsessed. He studied shoe weight, running form, traction, tiny performance details most people ignored. He cut shoes apart, experimented constantly, tested strange ideas. Sometimes his athletes probably thought he was slightly crazy, but Bowerman genuinely believed small innovations could change athletic performance. And psychologically, people like that are fascinating. They rarely feel satisfied. Even when things work well, their minds immediately start asking another question. What if this could still be better? After college, Phil faced a kind of uncertainty many people experience in their early 20s. He didn't fully know what his future was supposed to become. He went to Stanford Business School, tried to think practically about life, but something still felt unsettled. During one class assignment, he wrote a paper exploring an idea that sounded almost random at the time. German cameras had once dominated photography, but Japanese companies eventually disrupted the market with cheaper, high-quality alternatives. Phil wondered if the same thing could happen with athletic shoes. At the time, German brands like Adidas controlled the running world. But what if Japanese manufacturers could eventually compete? It sounded like a simple business theory, a classroom idea. But sometimes entire futures quietly begin like that. One small question that refuses to disappear from someone's mind. After Stanford, Phil traveled around the world, and travel changes people in ways that are difficult to explain, especially when they're young and uncertain about who they want to become. You leave familiar routines behind. You start imagining different possibilities, different versions of yourself. During a stop in Japan in the early 1960s, Phil visited a company called Onitsuka Tiger, known today as Asics. Their running shoes impressed him immediately. They felt lighter, simpler, more modern than many American shoes at the time. And suddenly, that old business school idea no longer felt theoretical. It felt real. There was only one problem. Phil didn't actually have a company. No office, no employees, no infrastructure, nothing. But somehow, inside that meeting, he introduced himself as a representative of a business called Blue Ribbon Sports. The strange thing is that Blue Ribbon Sports barely existed. It was mostly an idea in his imagination. But confidence can create momentum before reality catches up. And incredibly, the Japanese company agreed to work with him. When Phil left Japan, he carried something much heavier than boxes of shoes. He carried possibility. But possibility can become terrifying once it enters the real world. Because now, failure becomes public. Now, excuses disappear. At first, Blue Ribbon Sports was tiny. Phil worked as an accountant during the day, then sold shoes whenever he could. He drove to track meets across California and Oregon, opened the trunk of his car, talked directly to runners. Some days probably felt almost embarrassing. Imagine standing in parking lots trying to convince athletes to trust unfamiliar Japanese shoes instead of famous established brands. There was no glamorous startup culture back then. No podcasts calling founders visionaries, no venture capital investors throwing millions at young entrepreneurs, just exhaustion, highways, long drives, uncertainty, and constant financial pressure. But slowly, something interesting started happening. Runners genuinely liked the shoes, especially serious runners. Word spread quietly through athletic communities. Bill Bowerman became deeply involved too. And Bowerman wasn't interested in building a fashion empire. He cared about performance. He wanted athletes to move faster, lighter, more efficiently. Sometimes he became so obsessed with shoe design that people around him probably found it exhausting. But obsession is often uncomfortable up close. From a distance, successful people look inspiring. Nearby, they often look restless, never satisfied, constantly searching for improvement. And while Blue Ribbon Sports slowly expanded, another problem was growing quietly beneath the surface. Money. More specifically, the lack of it. One of the most stressful parts of Phil Knight's journey was that the company often looked successful externally while internally feeling dangerously unstable. Sales grew, demand increased, but growth itself created pressure. More inventory had to be ordered. More shipments arrived. More cash was required. Some weeks, the company was selling more shoes than ever before, while secretly getting closer to financial disaster. Trucks full of inventory would arrive before the company had enough money to pay for previous shipments. Banks became a constant source of anxiety. Phil later described endless meetings with lenders who didn't fully trust the business. And psychologically, that kind of pressure changes people. Imagine waking up every morning, knowing employees depend on you, while privately wondering whether the company might collapse in a few months. Imagine trying to appear confident during meetings, while secretly calculating bills in your head. Success stories often sound exciting afterward. Living through them usually feels much messier. Yet somehow, Blue Ribbon Sports kept moving forward. And timing helped enormously. During the 1970s, running exploded in popularity across America. More people became interested in fitness, jogging, and personal health. What once looked like a niche athletic hobby suddenly became part of mainstream culture. But Nike's future success wasn't only about shoes, it was about psychology. America itself was changing emotionally. People became more focused on self-improvement, identity, individuality, and physical transformation. Running started representing something larger than exercise. It became emotional, a way to feel disciplined, productive, free. And Nike would eventually understand that emotional shift better than almost anyone. But before Nike became Nike, another crisis appeared. The relationship between Blue Ribbon Sports and Onitsuka Tiger began deteriorating. Tensions grew, mistrust increased. There were fears about distribution rights and future control. And suddenly, Phil faced a terrifying possibility. The company he had spent years building might lose access to the very product keeping it alive. Imagine that moment psychologically. Years of sacrifice, years of uncertainty. And now the foundation itself suddenly feels unstable. This became one of the most important turning points in the entire story. Because instead of remaining distributors, Phil Knight and his team made a dangerous decision. They would build their own brand, their own products, their own identity. The new company needed a name. Eventually, they chose Nike, inspired by the Greek goddess of victory. At first, not everyone even liked the name. Some thought it sounded strange, but the bigger challenge was building something completely independent. A young design student named Carolyn Davidson created the famous swoosh logo for only $35. It's almost impossible to imagine now. One of the most recognizable symbols on Earth, beginning as a tiny freelance project. At that moment, nobody involved truly understood what they were creating. Around the same time, Bill Bowerman continued experimenting obsessively with shoe technology. One morning, while eating breakfast, he stared at a waffle iron and became fascinated by the pattern. The idea sounds almost ridiculous now, but obsession often produces strange moments like that. Bowerman poured rubber into a waffle iron, trying to create a better running sole. The result looked rough and experimental, but it worked. Better traction, lighter design, innovation rarely appears polished in the beginning. Usually it looks awkward, risky, and slightly irrational. Slowly, Nike started becoming something different, not just another shoe company, a company with energy, personality, emotion. But financially, the pressure remained brutal. There were moments when Phil Knight genuinely feared everything could collapse. Employees worked exhausting hours. Cash flow problems continued. Banks remained skeptical. The company expanded rapidly while still feeling fragile internally. And this is one of the most fascinating parts of the Nike story. Looking backward, success feels inevitable. Living through it feels terrifying. Inside uncertainty, nobody knows whether they're building the future or wasting years of their life chasing something impossible. Then Nike discovered something that would change the company forever. The company realized it wasn't only selling athletic products, it was selling emotion, identity, aspiration. Most sports advertising before Nike focused heavily on product details, materials, durability, technical specifications. Nike approached things differently. Nike sold feelings, fear, ambition, persistence, the emotional experience of pushing yourself beyond your limits. And that strategy changed advertising forever. Because psychologically, humans rarely buy products only for practical reasons. People buy versions of themselves. They buy hope, confidence, identity. Wearing Nike started feeling symbolic, like becoming part of a mindset. And nobody represented that transformation more powerfully than Michael Jordan. When Nike signed Jordan during the 1980s, it wasn't considered an obvious guaranteed success. In fact, Jordan originally preferred Adidas. Nike was still trying aggressively to compete with larger established brands. But the partnership became legendary. The Air Jordan line exploded into something much larger than basketball shoes. Suddenly, sneakers weren't just sports equipment anymore. They became fashion, status, music culture, street identity. Entire generations emotionally connected themselves to products through sports culture, and Nike understood how to amplify that better than almost anyone else. But while the company looked increasingly unstoppable from the outside, internally, the pressure never truly disappeared. Because success creates new fears. Once companies become dominant, maintaining dominance becomes psychologically exhausting. Expectations rise constantly. Investors demand growth. Competitors attack aggressively. Public attention intensifies. Inside Nike, the culture often remained intensely competitive. Phil Knight himself was known for being emotionally demanding and deeply obsessed with the company. Employees sometimes described tense meetings, difficult criticism, and enormous internal pressure. But maybe that intensity partly explains why Nike kept evolving instead of becoming comfortable, because comfort can quietly destroy ambitious companies. Meanwhile, Nike expanded globally. The swoosh appeared everywhere: Olympic athletes, football stadiums, basketball courts, giant city advertisements, music videos, fashion magazines. By the 1990s, Nike no longer felt like a sports company. It felt like part of modern culture itself. And something psychologically fascinating happened during this period. Millions of people wearing Nike products barely played sports at all. They wore the brand emotionally, for identity, confidence, belonging. Nike had transformed movement itself into branding, but success also brought criticism. During the 1990s and early 2000s, Nike faced increasing backlash over labor conditions in overseas factories. Reports emerged describing poor working environments, low wages, and exploitation within parts of the company's supply chain. Suddenly, Nike's image became more complicated. This was deeply uncomfortable because the brand had built itself around empowerment and inspiration. Critics now questioned whether the emotional story Nike sold publicly matched the reality behind production. And this reveals another truth about modern companies. The bigger a brand becomes emotionally, the more people expect moral meaning from it too. Consumers no longer judge only products. They judge values, ethics, identity. Nike eventually responded with reforms, transparency efforts, and factory monitoring systems. But the controversy showed how difficult it becomes for massive global companies to fully control the systems supporting their growth. Meanwhile, technology and culture continued changing rapidly. Social media transformed advertising. Attention spans shifted. Younger audiences consumed culture differently, and Nike faced the same invisible danger that eventually threatens almost every dominant brand: becoming ordinary. Familiarity creates comfort, but it can also slowly remove emotional energy. Somehow, Nike adapted again. Through storytelling, celebrity partnerships, digital culture, and constant reinvention, the company managed to remain emotionally relevant across generations. But beneath the success remained a surprisingly human story. Because when people think about Nike today, they imagine confidence, power, victory, perfection. Yet the company itself was born from uncertainty, exhaustion, debt, and fear. A young man sleeping in his car beside boxes of shoes while quietly wondering whether any of this would actually work. And maybe that's why the story still resonates emotionally decades later. Not because Nike became rich, but because its beginning felt fragile and painfully uncertain. Phil Knight once described those years as constant chaos, constant movement between excitement and fear. And honestly, many people understand that feeling even outside business, the sensation of moving forward without guarantees, pretending confidence while privately feeling terrified, building something before the world understands why it matters. There's another layer to this story too. Nike didn't simply grow because it made good products. It grew because it understood human psychology unusually well. The company recognized that sports were never only about sports. They were about identity, discipline, recognition, fear of failure, desire for transformation. When someone buys running shoes, they're often buying a future version of themselves, a healthier self, a stronger self, a more disciplined self. Nike built an empire around that emotional tension between who people are and who they hope to become. And psychologically, that's incredibly powerful. But maybe the strangest part of the entire story is this. During those early years, sleeping inside cars and driving endlessly between track meets, Phil Knight probably didn't fully realize he was building a cultural force. He was simply trying to survive long enough to keep moving forward, which is often how massive transformations actually begin. Quietly, imperfectly, without certainty. Today, Nike is one of the most recognizable brands on Earth. The swoosh is understood almost everywhere. Children recognize it before they fully understand business itself. Athletes build careers around it. Entire fashion movements connect themselves to it. Yet behind all that global power remains a much smaller image. A young man, alone, in a parked car, late at night, boxes of shoes beside him, bills waiting, pressure building, no guarantee of success, just movement, just persistence. And maybe that's why this story still feels strangely emotional today, because deep down, people aren't only fascinated by giant companies, they're fascinated by fragile beginnings, by moments when the future still looked uncertain, because uncertainty feels human. Everyone experiences it in some form. And perhaps that's the uncomfortable truth, hidden inside the Nike story. Most people only notice success after the world already recognizes it. They don't see the invisible years before momentum appears, the years where ambition and fear exist together every single day. They don't see how psychologically exhausting it feels to keep believing in something while reality constantly threatens to shut it down. But those invisible years often shape everything. Somewhere along the way, Nike stopped being a company about shoes. It became a symbol connected to movement itself, to ambition, to the idea that discomfort might lead somewhere meaningful. And whether people loved the brand or criticized it, almost everyone understood emotionally what the swoosh represented. Motion, forward momentum, refusing to stay still, which feels strangely fitting considering how the company started. Because before Nike became a global empire, before stadiums and celebrities and billion-dollar campaigns, there was simply a young man driving through dark highways with shoes in the back of his car, trying to keep a fragile dream alive long enough to see what it could become. And maybe that's the reason the story still matters. Not because Nike became powerful, but because it reminds people how invisible most beginnings really are. The world usually sees success only after it becomes impossible to ignore. But somewhere before every giant company, every movement, every empire, there's almost always a quieter chapter filled with uncertainty that nobody remembers later. A chapter where failure still feels more realistic than victory. A chapter where survival itself feels like progress. And somewhere tonight, in some parking lot, garage, apartment, or tiny office, someone else is probably sitting alone with an idea that currently looks too small, too risky, or too unrealistic to matter, just like Nike once did.
Thank you so much for listening to this audiobook. I truly hope these words inspired you, motivated you, and gave you something valuable to take with you into everyday life. If you enjoyed this recording, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and explore my other inspiring audiobooks created to support your growth, mindset, and motivation. Your support means a lot and helps me create more content for listeners like you. See you in the next audiobook.